My name is Amanda Pinzone, and today we're going to be going over Sanjay's intervention procedures and kind of how to implement them, the materials needed, and all of the items that we will need to complete this intervention with fidelity. So, the objectives for this training is to understand and define Sanjay's tantrum behaviors, to differentiate between examples and non examples of his tantrum behaviors, understand the materials needed for interventions, and understand how to implement the intervention and how to implement different portions of the intervention. So, before we begin, I kind of want to go over our behavioral definition and kind of explain what exactly the tantrum behaviors look like and what we are counting as tantrum behaviors, and kind of provide some examples and non examples. Before we begin with this definition, I think it is also important to understand that the function of Sanjay's behaviors is escape. So, tantrum behaviors are defined as any singular instance or combination of stomping one or both feet up and down, so bring your feet up and putting it back down to the floor, screaming or whining above a conversational level, so typically if it can be heard across the room or through another classroom, we would count that as screaming or whining above conversational level, and crying with or without tears. The onset of a tantrum behavior is marked as the first instance of any of the listed behaviors above, lasting at least 10 seconds following an identifiable antecedent. So, for example, the item that Sanjay wants is denied, or he is told to enter the classroom. And the tantrum is considered to have ended when when Sanjay has ceased all tantrum-related behaviors for a minimum of 30 seconds, consecutive seconds, without re-engaging in tantrum behaviors. So an example of this is Sanjay is asked to come into the classroom and begins to stomp his feet and cry for more than 10 seconds. A non-example is Sanjay stubs his toe and begins to cry and scream. So before we begin the intervention and explaining kind of everything that we're going to be doing, it's important to know that there are materials that we do definitely need before beginning. So before we begin, the visual schedule that we will be using within the intervention needs to be prepared and updated, which we will explain exactly what that looks like a little later on. It also needs to be within sight and within reach, preferably in your hands before starting the intervention. Reinforcers will also be needed and to be available and within sight. And finally, of course, our data collection system. So, for example, if we're using clickers or a timer to collect duration of tantrum behaviors, that will also be needed for the intervention. So, to begin, before entering the classroom, the visual schedule will be presented and within line of sight. So this will be the visual schedule that we use. It will include parts of his morning routine that need to be completed. So from a to-do to an all-done side. So as I listed in the example, some of the items might be walking out of car, walking to the door, entering the classroom, hanging up backpack, eating breakfast. And so once we have completed that item, Sanjay will move it from the to-do to the all-done section. When presenting the enter classroom icon, provide a verbal time warning. So for example, that would be, we have 1 more minute before we go into the classroom, just as like an antecedent as a prep before we're going in. So typically I would do this if we had just moved, like let's say hanging up backpack from to do to all done, be like, hey, or as we're doing the backpack, just remind, hey, we have 1 more minute before we go into the classroom. Then when we present the enter classroom icon, before entering the classroom, present the visual icon with the verbal instruction to enter the classroom. So we're going to present it, so tap it and be like, okay, it's time to walk in, and provide that verbal instruction. We can tap, point, hand it to him, whichever, as long as it is presented and within sight. If Sanjay enters the classroom without engaging in tantrum behaviors, we're going to reinforce this, provide a high magnitude of behavior specific praise, great job walking in, and provide all that vocal language, I'm so proud of you, all those things, and then also provide some of our favorite reinforcers, which might be drawing, books, coloring, things like that, before beginning with classroom instructions. So, if Sanji does engage in tantrum behaviors, once the visual schedule and verbal instructions are provided, we're going to provide minimal attention to the behaviors. So, we're going to put them on extinction. We're not going to make any eye contact. We're going to minimize our vocal language. We're not going to tell him, like, stop, don't do that, or represent the demand a bunch of times. We're going to make sure that we are staying very neutral and minimal throughout that process. Then we're going to represent the visual schedule and maintain the demand to walk into the classroom while using first then statements in a neutral tone. So this might be first walk in, then we get book. First walk in, then we get coloring. Things like that, to kind of state that like it's not end all be all to walk into the classroom. Then we're going to also use differential reinforcement of other behaviors to reinforce other behaviors other than the tantrum behaviors. So all of the stomping feet, the whining, the crying, we're not going to reinforce those. But for example, if Sanji is laying on the floor and then stands up within the tantrum, we could reinforce that and say, hey, great job standing up. Now let's walk in. We're going to continue to use extinction procedures, so minimizing vocal language and minimizing eye contact and things like that. And we're not going to provide any reinforcement or intention for the behaviors listed within the tantrum definition. We're going to continue this procedure until Sanji enters the classroom. So, for example, if the tantrum lasts 5 minutes, we're going to continue putting those behaviors on extinction until we have either other behaviors that we can reinforce, like standing up, or we finally enter the classroom. Once Sanji enters the classroom, reinforce this behavior with behavior-specific praise. So great job walking in, move the icon to all done, and if we use the first then statement of first walk in, then book, then provide access to the items that were listed within that first then statement. We want to reinforce, obviously, the positive behavior. I think it's also important to differentially reinforce walking in without tantrum behaviors versus walking in with. So, as listed above, if we are walking in without engaging in tantrum behaviors at the beginning, making sure that we're reinforcing that with an extreme amount of like social praise, vocal language, behavior specific praise, maybe more access or more time with reinforcers versus when we're walking in after engaging in a tantrum behavior also. We still want to provide reinforcement for walking in even after engaging in tantrum behaviors, but we do want there to be somewhat of a difference between the two, to kind of signify that like one is more preferred than the other. So hopefully with this, we're able to implement the intervention with fidelity, and it makes it a bit more digestible when implementing in the future.